Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into one of the most pivotal moments in American history, if you're passionate about history like we are, make sure to hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment below telling us which Civil War battle you'd like us to cover next. Your support keeps this channel going, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens in this story. Alright, let's get into it. It's the summer of 1863. The American Civil War has been raging for over 2 years, and the nation is tearing itself apart. Brother fights brother, fathers stand against sons, and the very soul of America hangs in the balance. In the fields of Pennsylvania, in a small town that most people had never heard of, something extraordinary is about to happen. Something that will change the course of history forever. This is the story of Gettysburg. Picture this: General Robert E. Lee, the brilliant Confederate commander, has just achieved stunning victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. His army of Northern Virginia seems unstoppable. The Confederate leadership believes that one more decisive victory on Northern soil could break the Union's will to fight, perhaps even force European powers to recognize the Confederacy and intervene on their behalf. Lee is emboldened, confident, perhaps even a bit overconfident. He decides to take the war north into Pennsylvania. It's a bold strategy, really. By invading the North, Lee hopes to relieve pressure on war-torn Virginia, gather supplies from the abundant Pennsylvania countryside, and deliver a crushing blow that might end the war on Confederate terms. His army, roughly 75,000 strong, crosses the Potomac River in mid. They're a formidable force, battle-hardened veterans who have defeated larger Union armies time and again. They march with confidence, with hope, believing that their cause is just and their victory inevitable. Meanwhile, the Union Army of the Potomac, now under the command of General George Meade, scrambles to respond. Meade had only taken command days earlier, replacing the disgraced General Joseph Hooker. Imagine the pressure on this man's shoulders. He's leading an army of about 95,000 men, pursuing a Confederate force that has repeatedly humiliated Union commanders. The stakes couldn't be higher. If Lee wins on Northern soil, the war might be lost. The United States as we know it might cease to exist. Neither commander initially intended to fight at Gettysburg. The battle that would become the war's turning point began almost by accident. Confederate forces were searching for supplies, particularly shoes, which their army desperately needed. On the morning of July 1st, 1863, Confederate brigades approaching Gettysburg encountered Union cavalry under General John Buford. Buford, an experienced cavalry officer, immediately recognized the strategic importance of the terrain around Gettysburg. The town sat at the intersection of 10 roads, making it a crucial crossroads. More importantly, the high ground south of town, particularly Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge, offered tremendous defensive advantages. Buford made a fateful decision. Despite being outnumbered, he ordered his cavalry to dismount and fight as infantry, using their rapid-fire carbines to slow the Confederate advance. He knew that if he could hold out long enough, Union infantry would arrive to reinforce his position. It was a desperate gamble, but Buford understood warfare. He understood that in battle, sometimes hours or even minutes can determine the outcome of entire campaigns. The sound of gunfire echoed through the peaceful Pennsylvania countryside that morning. Farmers working their fields stopped and listened in horror as the unmistakable sounds of battle grew louder. The citizens of Gettysburg, a town of about 2,400 people, had no idea that their community was about to become the site of the Civil War's bloodiest battle. As more Confederate forces arrived, the fighting intensified. Union General John Reynolds, one of the Army of the Potomac's most capable commanders, rushed forward with his infantry corps. Reynolds understood immediately what Buford had grasped, that this ground was worth fighting for. As he directed his troops into position near a wooded area called McPherson's Woods, a Confederate sharpshooter's bullet struck him in the back of the head. He fell from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The Union had lost one of its finest generals in the battle's opening hours. The fighting on July 1st was fierce and confused. More units from both armies continued to arrive throughout the day, feeding into the battle piecemeal. The Confederates, with their superior numbers on the field that first day, gradually pushed the Union forces back through the town. Union soldiers retreated in disorder, many becoming casualties or prisoners as they fled through Gettysburg streets. Citizens watched from windows and doorways as the blue-coated soldiers ran past. pursued by screaming Confederate infantry. But here's where the story takes a crucial turn. The Union forces didn't break completely. They rallied on Cemetery Hill, just south of town, exactly where Buford had hoped they would. As the sun began to set on that first day, General Meade arrived to assess the situation. He looked at the terrain, at the high ground his forces now held, and he made his decision. They would stay. They would fight here. The Army of the Potomac would make its stand at Gettysburg. That sets the stage for day 2 of this monumental battle. The first day was a Confederate victory, but the Union held the high ground. What will happen next? We'll cover the brutal fighting at Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and the wheat field in our next episode. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. As darkness fell on July 1st, both armies prepared for what everyone knew would come next. General Meade spent the night positioning his troops along what military historians now call the Fishhook, a defensive line that curved from Culpes Hill on the north, along Cemetery Hill down Cemetery Ridge, and ending at 2 rocky hills called Little Round Top and Big Round Top on the south. It was a superb defensive position, giving Union artillery commanding fields of fire and allowing Meade to shift troops quickly along interior lines. Robert E. Lee, meanwhile, faced a dilemma. His army had won the first day's fight, but the Union forces had not been destroyed. They held the high ground, and more Union troops were arriving by the hour. Lee's second-in-command, General James Longstreet, urged him to disengage and maneuver around the Union army, forcing Meade to attack them in a defensive position of their own choosing. But Lee, perhaps intoxicated by his recent victories, perhaps believing his army invincible, decided to continue the attack. He was convinced that his men could break the Union line. Let me tell you about the second day of Gettysburg, because if the first day was chaotic, the second day was absolutely brutal. Lee's plan was to attack both ends of the Union line simultaneously. General Richard Ewell would assault Culpes Hill and Cemetery Hill on the Union right, while Longstreet would attack the Union left flank, which Lee believed extended only partway down Cemetery Ridge. If successful, these coordinated attacks would crush the Union army in a massive pincer movement. But as military historians love to point out, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Delays plagued the Confederate attack from the start. Longstreet, who disagreed with Lee's tactics, was slow to move his corps into position. By the time his troops were ready to attack in the late afternoon, the tactical situation had changed dramatically. Union General Daniel Sickles had made an unauthorized and potentially disastrous decision. Sickles, a politician turned general with more ambition than military sense, disliked his assigned position along Cemetery Ridge. He thought he saw better ground nearly a mile forward, along the Emmitsburg Road near a peach orchard. Against orders, he moved his entire 3rd Corps forward into this exposed position, creating a salient that jutted out from the main Union line like a sore thumb. When Meade discovered what Sickles had done, he was furious. The 3rd Corps was now dangerously exposed, separated from the main Union line, vulnerable to being overwhelmed and destroyed. And that's exactly what nearly happened. When Longstreet's attack finally came, it hit Sickles' exposed corps with devastating force. Picture this scene: 20,000 Confederate soldiers emerging from the woods in parade ground formation, battle flags flying, the sun glinting off thousands of bayonets. They march forward with that distinctive rebel yell echoing across the fields. The Union troops, watching them come, must have felt their hearts in their throats. The fighting that erupted was some of the most savage of the entire war. In a wheat field that would forever after be known simply as the wheat field, the ground changed hands 6 times in a few hours. Men fought hand-to-hand with bayonets, rifle butts, even rocks and fists. In a jumbled maze of massive boulders called the Devil's Den, soldiers fought from rock to rock, sharpshooters picking off targets with deadly precision. The air was thick with smoke, the ground slick with blood, and the screams of wounded men mixed with the thunder of artillery. The peach orchard that Sickles had occupied became a killing ground. Confederate artillery tore gaping holes in the Union ranks. Sickles himself was hit by a cannonball that shattered his leg. He would survive, but his 3rd Corps was being destroyed. The Union line was on the verge of collapse. If it broke, if the Confederates could exploit the gap, they could roll up the entire Union position and win the battle, perhaps win the war. This is where individual acts of heroism became crucial. All across the battlefield, Union commanders made split-second decisions that would determine the outcome. General Winfield Hancock, commanding the Union Second Corps, personally directed reinforcements to the most threatened points. He rode his horse directly into the firestorm, inspiring his men by his calm presence under fire. Regiments were rushed forward, often arriving just in time to plug gaps in the line before the Confederates could break through. And then there's Little Round Top. This is one of the most famous episodes of the entire battle, and for good reason. This rocky hill anchored the extreme left of the Union line. If the Confederates captured it, they could place artillery on its summit and enfilade the entire Union position, making Cemetery Ridge untenable. The battle would be lost. But here's the thing, the hill was almost undefended. Through a combination of miscommunication and Sickles' unauthorized advance, Little Round Top sat there, empty and vulnerable. Union General Governor Warren, Meade's chief engineer, rode to the hilltop to survey the battlefield and realized with horror that Confederate troops were moving toward it. He could see them through the trees, thousands of men from Alabama and Texas, climbing the western slope. In minutes they would reach the summit. Warren acted immediately. He grabbed every unit he could find and rushed them to Little Round Top. One of these regiments was the 20th Maine, commanded by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, a former college professor who had volunteered for service. Chamberlain's regiment reached the summit just minutes before the Confederates attacked. What followed was extraordinary. The 20th Maine, positioned at the very end of the Union line, found itself assaulted repeatedly by Confederate forces determined to seize the hill. The fighting was desperate, close-range combat among the rocks and trees. Chamberlain's men fought with incredible determination, but their ammunition was running low. After repulsing several attacks, Chamberlain realized they couldn't withstand another assault. His men were exhausted, many were wounded, and they had almost no ammunition left. So Chamberlain did something audacious. He ordered a bayonet charge. His men fixed bayonets and, at his command, charged down the hill into the surprised Confederate troops. It was a desperate move, the kind of decision you make when you have no other options. But it worked. The Confederates, themselves exhausted and surprised by this sudden aggression, broke and ran. Little Round Top was saved, and with it, the Union position. As darkness mercifully ended the fighting on July 2nd, both armies lay exhausted across the battlefield. But if you think the soldiers got any rest, you'd be wrong. The night between the 2nd and 3rd days of Gettysburg was perhaps the longest night many of those men ever experienced. Let me paint you a picture of what that night was like, because it's something we often overlook when we talk about battles. Imagine you're a soldier lying on that battlefield. The temperature has dropped, and you're cold, despite the July date. The sounds around you are horrifying. Thousands of wounded men are crying out for water, for help, for their mothers. Some are screaming in agony. Others are moaning softly as their lives drain away. The smell is overwhelming, a nauseating mixture of blood, gunpowder, and torn earth. You haven't eaten properly in days. You're exhausted beyond measure, but adrenaline and fear keep you awake. Medical personnel on both sides worked through the night by lantern light, performing amputations and treating wounds with the limited resources available. Civil War medicine was primitive by modern standards. Surgeons worked without anesthesia beyond whiskey and perhaps chloroform if they were lucky. They amputated shattered limbs by the hundreds, throwing them into growing piles outside field hospitals. The sawing of bone was a sound that haunted men for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, the generals planned. Lee met with his corps commanders to discuss the next day's attack. Longstreet again urged caution, suggesting they disengage and maneuver around the Union flank. But Lee was convinced that Meade had weakened his center to reinforce both flanks during the day's fighting. He believed the Union line along Cemetery Ridge was vulnerable. He would attack there, in the center, with everything he had. On the Union side, Meade held a council of war with his commanders in a small farmhouse. The question was simple: should they stay and fight, or should they retreat? The discussion was intense. Some generals argued for withdrawal, others for standing firm. Finally, Meade went around the room asking each general his opinion. The consensus was to stay. They would defend their position. Meade agreed, and as the meeting broke up, he made a prediction that would prove chillingly accurate. He told one of his generals that if Lee attacked tomorrow, it would be at the center of the Union line. In the Confederate camps, men cleaned their weapons, wrote letters home by firelight, and tried to prepare themselves mentally for what was coming. Many soldiers had a sense of foreboding. The Army of Northern Virginia had never failed before, But something felt different about this battle. The Union troops were fighting harder, more desperately than they had in previous engagements, and the Confederate casualties had been severe. Thousands of empty spaces existed in the ranks where men had stood just days before. General Lewis Armistead, a Confederate brigade commander, spent part of the night with his friend General Winfield Hancock. Whereat you might say, weren't they enemies? Well, yes and no. Before the war, Armistead and Hancock had been close friends, both serving as officers in the United States Army. When the war broke out, Armistead had gone south with Virginia, while Hancock remained loyal to the Union. Now they commanded troops on opposite sides of the battlefield. On this night, through a strange twist of fate and military courtesy, they met briefly under a flag of truce. Armistead gave Hancock his prayer book and some personal effects, asking Hancock to deliver them to his family if he didn't survive. They both knew that tomorrow they might be trying to kill each other. The ordinary soldiers didn't have such dramatic encounters, but they had their own rituals. Many men wrote what they thought might be their last letters home. They pinned pieces of paper with their names and addresses to their uniforms so their bodies could be identified if they fell. Some prayed, others played cards or told stories, anything to keep their minds off what was coming. Veterans knew from experience what a major assault would cost. The newer recruits, the ones who had never been in a big fight, tried to convince themselves they wouldn't be the ones to die. On Cemetery Ridge, Union soldiers strengthened their defensive positions as best they could in the darkness. They built up stone walls, stacked fence rails, dug shallow entrenchments. They positioned their artillery carefully, ensuring overlapping fields of fire. The Union artillerists, knowing they would face a massive Confederate assault, prepared for the fight of their lives. They stacked ammunition close at hand, cleaned and checked their guns, and got what rest they could. July 3rd dawned hot and humid. A thick early morning fog lay across the battlefield. But as the sun rose higher, it burned away to reveal a brilliant summer day. Both armies had been ordered to maintain silence until the attack commenced. The battlefield, which had roared with combat for 2 days, fell into an eerie quiet. Men on both sides waited, watched, and wondered. Lee's plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its boldness. He would mass his artillery, nearly 140 guns, and bombard the Union center for 2 hours. This massive cannonade would supposedly weaken or destroy the Union defenses. Then, 12,000 fresh troops would march across 3/4 of a mile of open ground, climb Cemetery Ridge, and break through the Union line. If successful, the Confederate Army would split the Army of the Potomac in two and destroy it piecemeal. Command of the assault fell to General George Pickett's division, along with divisions commanded by Johnston Pettigrew and Isaac Trimble. Pickett, a flamboyant Virginia gentleman with perfumed hair and fancy uniforms, had arrived with fresh troops who hadn't been bloodied in the first 2 days of fighting. His men were ready, eager even, to prove themselves. They didn't yet know what they were about to face. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Confederate artillery opened fire. The sound was like nothing anyone had ever heard before. 140 cannons firing simultaneously created a roar that could be heard 50 miles away. The ground shook. Windows in Gettysburg shattered from the concussion. On Cemetery Ridge, Union soldiers hugged the ground as shells exploded around them, sending up geysers of earth and deadly fragments of metal. But here's where things didn't go according to Lee's plan. Much of the Confederate artillery fire was overshooting the Union line. Shells that should have been smashing Union infantry positions were instead falling harmlessly in the rear areas. Confederate gunners, unable to see their targets clearly through the thick smoke, were elevating their barrels too high. Meanwhile, Union artillery, initially responding vigorously to the bombardment, suddenly fell silent. The Confederate gunners thought they had destroyed the Union batteries. Mission accomplished, they reported. But it was a trick. Union artillery commanders had ordered their guns to cease fire, to conserve ammunition, and to make the Confederates think they had been knocked out of action. It was a deception that would prove devastatingly effective. The cannonade ended. For a few moments, an unnatural silence fell across the battlefield, broken only by the moans of wounded men and the ringing in thousands of ears. Then came the orders. Confederate officers moved among their men, forming them into line. 12,000 soldiers, representing the cream of the Army of Northern Virginia, prepared to advance. Let me describe what was about to happen, because Pickett's charge, as history remembers it, represents perhaps the most famous assault in American military history. It was also one of the most doomed from the start, though the men who participated couldn't have known that as they formed their ranks, the attacking force formed a line nearly a mile wide. In the center was General Pickett's division, 3 brigades of Virginians who had been waiting for 2 days to get into the fight. On their left was Pettigrew's division, and further left was Trimble's division. They formed in the woods and behind ridge lines on Seminary Ridge, preparing to cross the valley between the two armies. General Armistead, the same officer who had met with his old friend Hancock the previous night, walked among his men giving final instructions. He would lead his brigade with his black hat placed on the tip of his sword, held high so his men could follow him. It was an act of tremendous courage, making himself a target, but it was also necessary. In the smoke and confusion of battle, soldiers needed to see where their commander was. At approximately 3 o'clock, the Confederate line began to advance. 12,000 men stepped out from the cover of Seminary Ridge and began their march across the open valley. They moved in parade ground formation, maintaining their alignment, battle flags flying, officers riding horses at the front. It must have been a magnificent sight, the kind of pageantry that makes warfare seem almost glorious when viewed from a distance. But the Union soldiers waiting on Cemetery Ridge weren't viewing this from a distance. They could see every detail as the massive Confederate formation approached, and what they saw made their blood run cold. Row after row of enemy soldiers, extending as far as the eye could see, marching toward them with deadly purpose. Union officers called out orders, steadying their men, making sure everyone was ready. Then the Union artillery opened fire, and the true nightmare began. The guns that the Confederates thought had been destroyed roared back to life. 70 Union cannons concentrated their fire on the approaching column. At first, firing solid shot that plowed bloody lanes through the Confederate ranks. Men simply disappeared, torn apart by iron balls traveling at supersonic speeds. Other men stepped forward to close the gaps, maintaining formation, still advancing. As the Confederates drew closer, the Union artillery switched to explosive shells that burst above the lines, showering the troops below with deadly fragments. Then, when the range decreased further, canister, essentially giant shotgun shells filled with iron balls. Each canister blast turned a cannon into a massive shotgun, sweeping away entire sections of the attacking line. The Confederates kept coming. This is what's almost impossible to comprehend about Pickett's charge. Despite the horrific casualties, despite seeing their comrades torn apart around them, despite every instinct screaming at them to take cover or retreat, these men kept advancing. Their courage was beyond question. But courage alone doesn't win battles against superior firepower and strong defensive positions. As the Confederate line crossed the Emmetsburg Road, about halfway to their objective, Union infantry opened fire. Thousands of rifled muskets added their deadly hail to the artillery fire. The Confederate formation began to fragment. Units became intermingled. The careful battle lines dissolved into a mass of men pushing forward simply because there was nowhere else to go. General Garnett, one of Pickett's brigade commanders, was killed by a bullet to the head. General Kemper was shot from his horse, grievously wounded. General Armistead continued forward, his hat still raised on his sword, leading what remained of his brigade toward a low stone wall on Cemetery Ridge. Behind that wall, Union soldiers from the 2nd Corps waited, their rifles loaded and ready. A few hundred Confederate soldiers, Armistead and his brigade among them, actually reached the wall. They clambered over it, pushing back the Union defenders through sheer desperation and determination. For perhaps 15 minutes, Confederate battle flags waved on Cemetery Ridge. This moment became known as the high water mark of the Confederacy, the furthest point of the Confederate advance, not just at Gettysburg, but metaphorically for the entire Confederate cause. Armistead, still leading his men, pointed his sword toward a Union artillery battery. "Give them the cold steel, boys," he shouted. Then he was hit, multiple bullets striking him down just feet from the cannon he had been charging. He fell mortally wounded among the guns. But there were too few Confederates and too many Union soldiers. Reinforcements from other Union units rushed to the breakthrough point. They surrounded the Confederate penetration and began pushing it back. The men who had made it to the wall were killed, wounded, or captured. Within minutes, the breakthrough had been sealed. Back across the valley, Confederate soldiers were retreating, not running in panic, but walking backward, still facing the enemy, still in some semblance of order, but retreating nonetheless. They had done everything humanly possible. They had marched across 3/4 of a mile of open ground under murderous fire. They had reached the enemy position and briefly reached it, but it hadn't been enough. The Union line had held. George Pickett, watching his division being destroyed, was beside himself with grief and rage. When Lee later asked him to prepare his division for a possible Union counterattack, Pickett reportedly responded, "General Lee, I have no division." Of the nearly 5,000 men in his division who had begun the charge, over 3,000 were casualties. Lee rode among the returning survivors, taking full responsibility for the disaster. "It's all my fault," he told them repeatedly. "This has been a sad day for us." He tried to rally them, to prepare for the Union counterattack he expected at any moment. But Meade, ever cautious, didn't order a counterattack. The Union army had won a tremendous victory, but Meade was content to hold his ground rather than risk throwing away his advantage with an ill-considered pursuit. As the afternoon wore on and it became clear that no Union attack was forthcoming, the magnitude of the Confederate disaster became apparent. The assault had failed catastrophically. The Army of Northern Virginia had suffered over 25,000 casualties. In 3 days of fighting, more than a third of Lee's entire army. The Union had suffered similar numbers, but unlike Lee, Meade could replace his losses. The Confederacy could not. That night, the battlefield was again filled with the cries of wounded men, but this time, the sound was different. Mixed with the cries of pain was a sense of finality. Men on both sides understood that something fundamental had changed. The myth of Confederate invincibility had been shattered. The Army of Northern Virginia could be beaten, had been beaten. July 4th, 1863, Independence Day. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. On the 87th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, two American armies faced each other across a corpse-strewn battlefield, waiting to see what would happen next. Let me tell you about the day after Pickett's charge, because in many ways, it was just as important as the battle itself. Robert E. Lee had expected a Union counterattack. His army, battered and depleted, prepared defensive positions and waited for Meade to attack. Lee's defensive line formed a careful arc along Seminary Ridge, the same ground from which his troops had launched their doomed assault the previous day. Confederate engineers worked through the night, positioning artillery and building earthworks. If the Union army came, they would face the same kind of defensive firepower that had destroyed Pickett's charge. But the attack never came. Meade, despite pressure from some of his subordinates to pursue the Confederates aggressively, chose caution. His army had suffered terribly as well. His command structure was damaged, with key generals killed or wounded. Many of his units were exhausted, disorganized, and low on ammunition, and he was facing Robert E. Lee, a commander who had repeatedly defeated Union armies that had attacked him rashly. Meade decided to let Lee make the next move. As the day progressed with no Union attack materializing, Lee made his decision. The invasion of the North had failed. His army needed to retreat back to Virginia before Meade changed his mind about attacking, or before Union reinforcements arrived to cut off their escape route. The retreat would be an enormous logistical challenge. Lee had thousands of wounded men, limited supplies, and a river crossing to navigate while a Union army watched his every move. But first, the grim work of dealing with the dead had to begin. And oh, it was grim. Over 50,000 casualties between both armies in 3 days of fighting meant that bodies littered the battlefield for miles. In the July heat, decomposition began quickly. The smell became unbearable. Soldiers detailed to burial duty wrapped cloth around their faces, but it did little to block the stench. Union forces had the easier task, relatively speaking. They controlled the battlefield and could bury their dead properly, though even then, the scale was overwhelming. They dug long trenches and placed bodies in them, dozens and sometimes hundreds in a single mass grave. Where possible, they tried to identify the dead and mark their graves. But many soldiers had no identification, and they went into the earth as unknown casualties. For the Confederates, the situation was worse. Lee couldn't spare the time or manpower for proper burials. His army had to prepare to retreat. Confederate dead were often left where they fell, or given hasty, shallow burials that barely covered the bodies. After the war, local citizens found Confederate remains scattered across their farms for years. The wounded faced an equally terrible fate. Civil War medicine couldn't save many of the severely wounded. Men with abdominal wounds, head wounds, or shattered limbs often died slow, agonizing deaths. Field hospitals on both sides worked around the clock, but they were overwhelmed. Surgeons operated until they could barely stand, moving from one patient to the next, deciding who might be saved and who was beyond help. The town of Gettysburg itself had become one giant hospital. Every church, public building, and many private homes held wounded soldiers. The civilians of Gettysburg, just 2,400 people, suddenly had to care for tens of thousands of wounded men. Women who had never seen such carnage found themselves changing bandages, administering water, and comforting dying soldiers. It was trauma on a scale these simple Pennsylvania farmers and merchants had never imagined. By the evening of July 4th, Lee had organized his retreat. A wagon train 17 miles long carried the Confederate wounded south toward Virginia. Picture that for a moment. 17 miles of wagons, each one carrying suffering men, moving slowly over rough roads. Every jolt, every bump caused agony for the wounded. Many died along the way. Those who couldn't be transported were left behind to become prisoners, their only hope being that Union doctors would treat them. The Army of Northern Virginia began its march south on July 5th. It was not a panicked flight, but an organized withdrawal, with rearguards positioned to slow any Union pursuit. Lee's army was retreating, but it was still dangerous. These were veteran troops who would fight savagely if cornered. Meade did pursue, but cautiously. His army shadowed the Confederate retreat, looking for an opportunity to strike, but never committing to a full-scale attack. Lincoln, back in Washington, was frustrated by Meade's caution. The president saw this as the chance to destroy Lee's army completely, to potentially end the war right here. He sent urgent telegrams to Meade, pushing him to attack before Lee could cross the Potomac River back into Virginia. The two armies engaged in several skirmishes during the retreat. At Williamsport, Maryland, Lee's army found the Potomac River, swollen from recent rains and unfordable. They were trapped on the northern bank, with the Union army approaching. Lee prepared defensive positions, ready to fight what might be the final battle of the campaign. But Meade, arriving at Williamsport, saw Lee's prepared defenses and decided not to attack. He called a council of war with his generals. The debate was intense. Some urged immediate attack, others counseled caution. Meade chose caution. He would reconnoiter the Confederate positions, bring up his artillery, and attack the next day. It was a decision that would haunt Meade for the rest of his career. That night, the Potomac River receded enough to ford. Lee's engineers threw together a pontoon bridge. Under cover of darkness, the Army of Northern Virginia crossed back into Virginia. By the time Meade was ready to attack, Lee was gone. Lincoln was furious when he received the news. "We had them within our grasp," he said. "We had only to stretch forth our hands, and they were ours. And nothing I could say or do could make the army move." It was a victory that felt incomplete, a chance missed to end the war in 1863 rather than letting it drag on for 2 more bloody years. But even if Meade didn't destroy Lee's army, the victory at Gettysburg was enormously significant. The Army of Northern Virginia had been stopped. The invasion of the North had failed. Lee would never again have the strength to mount such an offensive. The Confederacy, which had seemed on the verge of winning independence in the early summer of 1863, had been dealt a blow from which it would never fully recover. On the same day that Lee began his retreat from Gettysburg, July 4, 1863, another crucial Union victory occurred at Vicksburg, Mississippi. General Ulysses S. Grant accepted the surrender of the Confederate garrison there, giving the Union complete control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. Together, these two victories marked the turning point of the Civil War. The Confederacy could still fight, could still win battles, but it could no longer win the war. For months after the battle, President Abraham Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg for the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery. He wasn't the main speaker, but when his turn came, he spoke for just 2 minutes. Those 272 words became the most famous speech in American history. 47 years ago, Lincoln began reframing the entire meaning of the Civil War. This wasn't just about preserving the Union anymore. It was about fulfilling the promise that all men are created equal, ensuring that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Think about the weight of those words. Lincoln stood on ground where 7,000 men had died and 30,000 more had been wounded. He was telling the nation that these men hadn't died just to preserve a political arrangement. They had died for the proposition that democracy itself was worth dying for. So what did Gettysburg actually mean? In military terms, it was catastrophic for the Confederacy. Lee's army lost over 28,000 men, irreplaceable veterans and experienced officers. From Gettysburg onward, the Army of Northern Virginia would be permanently on the defensive. The battle also shattered Confederate hopes of foreign recognition. Britain and France, who had been watching closely, decided after Gettysburg and Vicksburg that the Confederacy would likely lose. Their chance for diplomatic support vanished. Strategically, Gettysburg ended Confederate hopes of winning through battlefield victory. After July 1863, their only hope was to make the war so costly that the North would negotiate a settlement. It was a survival strategy, and ultimately, it failed. The high water mark of the Confederacy, when Armistead's men briefly held Cemetery Ridge, was both literal and metaphorical. The Confederate cause would never again come so close to victory. For the individuals involved, Gettysburg became the defining experience of their lives. Joshua Chamberlain, the professor who led the bayonet charge on Little Round Top, went on to an extraordinary career, but he always considered that moment his finest hour. Robert E. Lee offered his resignation after the battle, accepting full responsibility. Though it was refused, Lee was never quite the same. His health deteriorated, and his army could never again mount major offensive operations. The town of Gettysburg bore scars for decades. Farmers plowing fields continued to unearth bones and bullets for generations. But the town also became one of America's first major tourist attractions. Veterans returned to walk the ground where they had fought, and the battlefield became a place where Americans came to grapple with the meaning of their bloody Civil War. What's the final takeaway from Gettysburg? Perhaps it's this: the fate of nations can turn on a few days, on key decisions made in crucial moments. John Buford choosing to hold McPherson's Ridge, Joshua Chamberlain ordering the bayonet charge, Robert E. Lee deciding to attack the Union Center. Each decision rippled outward, shaping the battle, the war, and ultimately the nation we live in today. Gettysburg reminds us that history isn't inevitable, that human choices matter, that individuals acting in moments of crisis can change the world. It reminds us of the terrible cost of war, especially civil war, where the enemy is your own countrymen, sometimes your own family. And perhaps most importantly, Gettysburg reminds us that some principles are worth fighting for. The men who defended Cemetery Ridge were fighting for the principle that human freedom was incompatible with slavery, that democracy required the freedom of all people, not just some. That's the legacy of Gettysburg. That's why we still study it, still visit the battlefield, still tell this story over 160 years later. Because in those 3 days in July 1863, on that small patch of Pennsylvania farmland, the future of democracy itself was at stake. And thanks to the courage, sacrifice, and blood of tens of thousands of soldiers, democracy survived. If you found this documentary enlightening, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most pivotal moments. Drop a comment below and let us know what battle or historical event you'd like us to cover next. Your engagement keeps this channel going. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.